The Simple Path to God, discovering the way back to authentic faith. Father Spiridon Bailey is a priest of the Diocese of Great Britain in Western Europe of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, serving in England and Ireland. On this video podcast, he applies the teaching of the Church Fathers to modern life with reference to the Sunday Gospels. Here now is Father Spiridon.
In the 14th chapter of the Gospel of St. Luke, we read of Jesus telling a parable of a man who throws a great banquet. He invites many people, he sends his servants out to call them to the feast, but they make excuses. First of all, we can say the apostles themselves went out with the invitation, went out into the four corners of the earth, and the invitation continues to be carried to all of our lives today. The feast itself can be interpreted as many things, and the Fathers interpreted it as the end of the world, or the kingdom of heaven, or simply the spiritual life, or life in God. But the first thing we must ask ourselves is, why would I turn down that invitation? What is it in my life that I find that distracts me from the call of God to the feast? First of all, we know that when man was expelled from paradise, he lost the discernment about what he should desire in life, what he should chase, what he should pursue. The Fathers use the word pleasure, particularly St. Gregory the Great says, we have fallen into a state where we pursue bodily, earthly pleasures instead of spiritual pleasures. And St. Gregory says, all of us in this fallen state chase after bodily and earthly pleasures, but when we taste of them, when we have our fill, we find that they are empty and they leave us unfulfilled. But the opposite is true of spiritual pleasures. At first, we may not even want them. We see them and we think, it requires self-discipline. It requires self-control to deny ourselves. Why would we want to taste of these things? And yet, when we do taste of spiritual pleasures, the desire and the longing for them grows in us. They begin to fulfill us until we are overcome with the longing to be fulfilled with the spiritual delights of God. So all of us are called to this banquet, this feast, and yet in the story we see how the men invited made excuses. I've just got married, I have a field. Worldly concerns, worldly responsibilities. One man says, I've just bought 5 yoke of oxen, the 5 yoke symbolizing the 5 senses. So we can be so consumed with our taste and the pleasures of our senses that we don't give ourselves to the spiritual realm, the spiritual pleasures of God, the taste of God. And yet we are called to thirst and hunger for righteousness, to thirst and hunger for God Himself. For to taste of the spiritual banquet is to know something of God. But there is one of these questions that so often are asked, like, why does God allow pain and so on? People say, well, if God is love, why does He allow anyone to turn away and refuse the banquet, to be condemned, to be expelled from the kingdom? Yes, there is free will. Yes, love is only real if we have the choice not to love. But these kinds of philosophical questions can often lead us into spirals. God has given us as much as we need. He has revealed to us everything that we need for our salvation. St. Gregory Palamas says to us, think of the ants. They share like us the nature of being creatures of God. They live on the earth. They are of the earth. They eat like us. They reproduce and so on. And yet, though they are creatures like us, all the ants in the world cannot begin to conceive for a moment of why we as human beings make the moral choices we make. Not for a moment can they begin to conceive of our thoughts. And if they, who are creatures like us, cannot conceive of our thoughts, how much more infinite distance is there between our thoughts and those of God? We cannot know the mind of God. There is a mystery to God that cannot be contained. We are finite, He is infinite. He says to us, as the heavens are high above the earth, so my thoughts are above your thoughts. And so in faith we must trust God. We must know that God loves every person equally. He calls and reaches out to every person equally and reveals to us all what is necessary for our salvation. It is up to us to search our hearts, to question ourselves, to say, to what extent am I responding to the invitation of God? Or am I making excuses and turning away?
The Simple Path to God, discovering the way back to authentic faith. Father Spiridon Bailey is the author of several books, including Orthodoxy and the Kingdom of Satan and Journey to Mount Athos. You can email Father Spiridon at simplepath@ancientfaith.com. That's simplepath@ancientfaith.com. This has been a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.